Well, for more on the nation's energy policy and to discuss the other big stories of the week, we're joined in the studio by federal Liberal MP Jason Falinski and New South Wales Greens MP David Shoebridge. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So energy policy, I suppose it occupies the minds of both of you, no matter what level of government you're engaged with. But Jason, for your part, the Turnbull government is making pretty heavy work of this clean energy policy or whatever target or whatever it's going to be called. Do you expect this to be finalised by year's end?
Well, I agree, Greg. We're doing a great job.
Before Christmas.
Sorry, before Christmas.
You'll get the policy done before
Look,
Christmas.
There'll be a Christmas present for
Boys will be
everyone
home before Christmas. All sorted.
underneath your Christmas tree,
no doubt.
David. I expect that we'll have something clarified by Christmas. Where the thing that we're obviously working on is making sure that energy policy and climate policy is aligned so that we meet our Paris agreements.
And where do you stand on that role for coal argument? Because that seems to be the one that is going to decide whether this attracts some form of bipartisanship or whether we remain divided on this as a nation.
Well, look, I'm not here to say that I'm pro-coal or pro-renewable. I'm just pro-affordable and reliable power. And I think that the important thing is for government to set out the framework that allows the market to come up with the best solution.
Well, in the meantime, we do hear from organisations, corporates such as AGL, that they found it really difficult to navigate this issue because of the lack of certainty. So what does that mean for the rest of us if we are wanting to look at things like affordability?
Well, every time you look at your power bill and you see an unnaturally large power bill, you can thank the failure of state and federal governments to come together and set a coherent energy policy, because nobody is going to invest in the major renewable energy projects that we need, the big battery projects that we need, even in the sort of strange world of the coalition party, their dream of some kind of new coal-fired power station. Nobody's going to go anywhere near those multi-billion-dollar investments until they have regulatory certainty, until they know and they can convince their finances and their shareholders what the policy framework is going to be like in 5 years' time. We don't even know what it's going to be like in 5 weeks' time. And so all of that uncertainty means we are dealing with seriously ageing generators. We don't have the policy framework to build those big renewable energy projects that will make our energy cheaper. And meanwhile, we have a government that's sort of blaming, a federal government that's blaming the state government having a few environmental controls on coal seam gas. It's the failure to set a national policy that's putting up power bills.
Miriam actually mentioned the word AGL there as a company. One of the astounding developments this week is that they're actually examining $250 million port for the importation of LNG in Victoria. So this could be ships sailing from the Middle East to Australia. Does it strike you as odd, Jason, that a nation like ours would be sailing ships full of liquefied gas?
It is just bizarre. It is the result of, I think, unscientific policy making at a state level that has banned the exploration and mining of even conventional gas, much less coal seam gas. I mean, Australia has about 500 years of reserves of conventional gas, but it is the equivalent of Saudi Arabia importing petrol. That's where we've got to. So, the thing is pretty bizarre. And David's right, we need regulatory certainty because what we have here is not market failure, but regulatory failure. And we need a science-based solution to these regulations, which has not been forthcoming for quite some time.
All right, and is it also that critical issue around a clean energy target? I mean, how important is that for this?
Well, that's got to be the centre point. I mean, Jason said, and I commend him for saying it, I don't think his government's delivering on it, but I commend him for at least saying the words that you need to have an energy...
Always with the dig.
energy policy. You need to have an energy policy linked to our climate goals. If we don't meet the climate goals, we're screwed long term. So that has to be the core focus of our energy policy. We have to meet the climate goals, but we're not going to get anywhere near that unless we can have major investments, and we're talking billions and billions of dollars in renewable energy by companies who know what their income stream over the next 5 to 10 years is going to look like. But if you don't know what your income stream over the next 5 months is going to look like, they're not going to put the money on the table. We're not going to have the investment in renewables, which everybody says is the cheapest way of building marginal power now.
All
it's
right,
renewables.
well, let's get to the major vibe of this weekend, of course, being grand final weekend. And it just happens to coincide with being in the midst of our same-sex marriage postal survey. Into that flies Macklemore, the rapper from...
So it's Macklemore. I thought it was Micklemore.
No,
it's Macklemore.
apparently all rookies say Macklemore and all in the know say Macklemore. So, Jason, should he be singing the Same Love song at tomorrow's grand final?
You know, to misquote Voltaire, I might not like his music, but I'll defend his right to sing it. So, yeah, sure. Look, it's a decision of the NRLs. If you don't like it, you know, stop listening, turn the station over, go and get a beer if you're at the ground. But otherwise, if people want to sing their song, they should be allowed to do it.
Do you think they entered into this with completely open mind, or do you think it was perhaps calculated, the invitation, to be somewhat provocative?
Well, if it was calculated, it's a brilliant move, and Todd Greenberg is to be congratulated for doing it. If it was uncalculated, he should claim that it was calculated so that he can accept his brilliance.
Well, it does tap into a broader conversation that we're also hearing this week, in particular, around the crossover between sport and politics. Some are saying that the two should never meet. Others are saying it's unavoidable that should be the case. And we've also had criticism of the AFL for taking a particular position with the Yes campaign in the same-sex marriage survey as well. Is it clear-cut?
Well, it's a same-sex sporting contest, from what I can tell. Two male teams having a go. I don't see why you can't have same-sex politics in a same-sex sporting competition. I haven't seen Tony Abbott offended by the idea of same-sex sporting competitions. But look, I think any time politicians try and impose their will on a community event or a sporting event, well, then it tends to look pretty ordinary. Particularly if you're seeing the sporting code, whether it's the National Football League in the US or it's the National Rugby League here in Australia, they're actually taking a progressive stance, and they're listening to, I think, their players, they're listening to their audience, and they're saying, you know what, we actually want to take a progressive stance on same-sex marriage. We actually want to take a progressive stance in the US on aggression by police. And when they make that stand, and then you see a lone politician, one or two, often right-wing politicians, come out and try and stand against them, well, I think they look pretty out of touch. They look pretty isolated, and in the long run, they're going to be judged harshly by the broader population.
So campaigning techniques come in all sorts of variations. You can sign write the sky, you can have a singer at a grand final. Increasingly, they use technology as well. And I think some people felt intruded as to their privacy with SMS messages last weekend. Corey Bernardi is robo-calling, apparently aiming for 1 million people, I think is the target.
That's a very distilled robot, isn't it? Corey Bernardi and a robot. It's like double robot.
Should people just accept that this is modern campaigning and get over it? Is this a modern variation of the door knock, for instance?
Well, I think we saw the right in politics say we need to have this big national debate on a plebiscite, and everybody's got to go out and talk about a plebiscite. We saw a lot of people on the progressive side of politics say this is going to be damaging and divisive, don't do this. And then we see a bunch of people from the right of politics offended when they get approached by the Yes campaign and say, well, how dare you contact me and politicise this plebiscite that we wanted. I mean, if you're going to have a national debate on something, you're going to have those kind of communications happening. I had the misfortune of listening to Corey Bernardi's no robo message, and the fascinating thing about...
I'm jealous. I didn't get a call.
Jason, I don't think I was on his call list.
You rang him.
I pulled it down.
Ladies and gentlemen, David Shoebridge rang Corey Bernardi.
I wouldn't recommend you do this, but you can pull it down off the SMH website. But the fascinating thing was, whilst he mentioned same-sex marriage in the first sentence, he didn't mention marriage again for the rest of it. It's this distraction debate they're trying to have. Talk about anything other than marriage in order to defeat the Yes campaign. And it was pretty offensive. You know, it was all apparently about gender fluidity and about not having control over your kids when they go to school. But whatever it is, according to Corey Bernardi, it's not about marriage. And I think that shows just how barren the argument has become.
Well, it's interesting because I do recall last weekend around the issue of those text messages being sent out that a lot of people, even regardless of their position, felt that it was an intrusive move. So is this just something that we're going to have to get used to?
Look, I'm probably the worst person to ask, because when it comes to spam emails, I always thought, we'll just delete them. If you don't like getting a text message from someone, just delete it. If you don't like getting a phone call from someone you don't know, just hang up. But yeah, this is, and I don't see it as a bad thing. I think it's a good thing that people can be more directly engaged in the political process and in the arguments. I think that it's, technology is allowing that. This is what will go on in elections. It happened, I have to say, during the last federal election where unfortunately people were mimicking or pretending to be from government agencies when they were calling people late at night. But this will happen, and we need to maybe advance the rules that we have around campaigning so that people are more aware about. I mean, that's the important thing, that there's...
That's actually been worked on, isn't it?
It's how
been
it's
worked
done.
on.
It's how
Yeah.
it's done. I agree with Jason. It's how it's done, not the fact that it's been done. It's when you get those people masquerading as being their opponent, or push polling. And we've all seen that, haven't we, Jason?
I've never seen it, David.
Oh,
It's been done to me.
But no. I mean, we've seen it in politics, the push polling, creating a straw man argument and then tearing it down in the course of a political communication. And it's the nature of the communication as opposed to the fact of it.
And just finally, we have the High Court, I think, starting to move very shortly on the hearings of the 7 federal MPs and senators, or mostly senators. All the submissions are now before the High Court, and it looks as though a good number of them could probably be counted out already based on the arguments we've seen. Malcolm Roberts, for one. How many do you think will be left standing? Take a pick, Jason.
I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to do this.
Yeah, but we're asking you as a bookie.
As a bookie? Oh, well, fair enough. Well, I'm taking better. Look, I noticed overnight Malcolm Roberts has said that he has the strongest case, so we'll have to wait and see what the justices of the High Court think. Look, David and I were talking about this beforehand. I have a view that the 92 decision, which was Sykes v Cleary, created a very dangerous precedent, which basically said that Section 44(1) does not rely on the laws or of the Commonwealth Parliament of Australia or the High Court of Australia, but basically subjected our Constitution, this one section of our Constitution, to the laws, regulations and deliberations of other countries, some of which no longer exist, and arguably some of which are yet to exist. It's a problem. David says, well, ignorance of the law is no excuse, and he's absolutely right. But are we to say that people have to have knowledge of laws that exist globally? Because that's what's going on at the moment, and laws that existed in the 1940s and the 1920s in some cases. So it's a problem that was created by the High Court, and hopefully the High Court can see its way to clarify.
I don't think it's a problem created by the High Court. It's a clear obligation that's in the Constitution, and it's, when you read it, it's in the baldest possible terms. And the fact is, if you have a family connection or a personal connection with a foreign country, then you've got to explore it before you put your hand up to run for the federal parliament. That's basically the way the law operates. And if you do find yourself having some potential for citizenship of a country you have a connection with, you have to renounce it. I've got to say,
hang on.
I've got to say,
David, no,
let me just finish.
If you can renounce it,
and that's right.
Sometimes,
and
so
for countries like the High Court has dealt with that. The High Court has dealt with that for Greece and those countries where you can't renounce it. You have to take reasonable steps.
So the Constitution applies to some people, but not to everyone.
No.
Because you can't renounce France, you can't renounce Lebanon.
I think the most amusing thing in those submissions, and I had the misfortune again of actually reading Brandis' submission,
and he did it in 7 minutes, which is really impressive.
And reading the submission put on by the two Green senators. Green senators say, well, the Constitution says this, and basically apply the Constitution. Brandis' one though says the Constitution says this, but it's a bit like Cory Bernardi's robocall. He doesn't mention that again. He just tries to talk about how awkward it all is. And then he basically says, well, ignorance should be a defence. Ignorance should be a defence. And I've got to tell you now, his submission is being photocopied and shared around local courts all around the country, all running up and being tendered in their road traffic transport offence and saying, oh, Your Honour, I didn't know it was 80 Ks. How could you possibly catch me? The Attorney General says ignorance is a defence. That can't be the law. That can't be the law. And if the High Court says that,
I don't believe that's what the Attorney General says.
We're going to have to agree to disagree, which is probably no surprise. Fabulous though to have you both with us, Jason Falinski and David Shoebridge.
Thanks.
No, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it is all down to the High Court now. Now, back to the grand final week.